Wherefore, Series 3, Episode 42. The Theatre Festival is plagued by irate fairies. This, of course, is not the official explanation for what happens during the course of the weekend, but there we go. Some things cannot safely be admitted to in public spaces. To be honest, if you've annoyed fairies, it is often safer not to draw attention to it, as this often just encourages them or enrages them further, which is effectively a lot like encouraging them. Whether I will get away with talking about this remains to be seen. I am in the happy position of being able to suggest that I'm just not worth the bother and hope that reality is feeling susceptible. The official story is that the problems were caused by performance-related technology not being used during lockdown. Things become damp or dusty. Spiders nest in them. Connections are made where connections should not be made, and thus it is quite understandable if things stop working, catch fire, or spontaneously transform into entirely different objects. No one really wants to talk about the box of microphones that turned out to be a box of toasters, or the box of frogs that turned out to be full of stand-up comedians. It was a complicated weekend, but despite best efforts to derail it, mostly everyone came through unscathed. Several of the theatre festival venues are hazardously close to bank gardens, a notorious hotspot for fairy activity. This is always complicated. On the one hand, the fairies really don't like loud music, which tends to put them in conflict with events in Lansdowne Hall. They also, for reasons of tradition, don't much like Christianity either, which puts them in conflict with everything happening at St Lawrence's Church. They do like it when people who are a bit off their faces wander into the gardens late at night, because this is an excellent and reliable source of food and entertainment for them. If you're imagining fairies stealing takeaway from drunk people, try again. The official story is that Hexagon, one of Stroud's long-standing amateur theatre companies, had to pull out because of COVID. Now, we have to be very careful with this one because the anti-vaxxers will latch onto anything where they can say COVID is being used to cover up something else. It is definitely not the case that all the people absent from work or school have been kidnapped by fairies or aliens, and we're not getting into the debate about whether or not that's essentially the same thing. Nor is COVID being used to cover up the number of round earthers falling off the edge of the flat earth and disappearing into space. This is not a thing. And the intersection between flat earthers and COVID deniers is something that could stand more scrutiny. COVID deaths are also not being used to disguise a mass public exodus into Ditchley Yat. This really should have been obvious. Ditchley isn't big enough, but it's easy to persuade people who have never been there. COVID is real. COVID deaths are real. The earth is round. Ditchley Yat is finite. We're all clear on this, yes? Also, don't take dewormers made for animals. Back to the issue of Hexagon. Those of you who dwell in Stroud may have heard that their show had to cancel, and you probably heard this from Adam Horowitz, who was supposed to be in it. There's a remarkable evil genius to all of this, because Adam was actually the one kidnapped by fairies, and they simply took his phone and did some social media posting on his behalf while he was distracted. People tend to assume that fairies and other magical beings are going to either be averse to technology or unable to use it. This is not true. Several high-profile social media accounts in the district are run by fairies and exist for the purpose of shits and giggles. I'm not going to out them, but just bear this in mind when you happen to be online. This is by no means the first time Adam Horowitz has been stolen by fairies. Adam is a poet, and he lives in one of Stroud's uncanny valleys, and as a consequence is pixie-led, and otherwise made off with on a fairly regular basis. They rather like him, and rightly so. He's a charming, witty and poetic chap, and thus just the sort of person fairies like to be entertained by of a weekend. His kidnap was not a deliberate attempt on their part to thwart the theatre festival. It was only after they had stolen him that they even realised the extra chaos this would cause. He has now been returned to his usual location and is about as unscathed as a poet ever is post-fairy encounter. Despite the best efforts of the fairy folk who frequent Bank Gardens, the theatre festival actually goes rather well and a good time is had by many. This is in no small part because of the ritual of the 42 chairs. This is an important protective measure that works remarkably well to subdue fairy activity during the theatre festival weekend. The ritual is performed as follows. A circle of people stand somewhere near the edge of Bank Gardens. Outside the door at Lansdowne is ideal because you can be heard from the gardens while not actually being in the gardens, which helps keep the ritualists safe. It is best to perform the ritual in daylight, also for safety reasons. Ritualists take whatever precautionary measures they deem appropriate and embark on a ritual retelling of the story of the 42 chairs. This refers to an event at the first theatre festival when the fairies first tried to disrupt proceedings. They did this by enchanting a theatre group to fill a venue with chairs, this causing all kinds of technical problems for the festival organiser, John Bassett. The story is told without reference to fairy interference, though, and it is critically important to have the wrong number of chairs in the ritual retelling. Ned, who is leading the ritual, speaks of the 43 chairs and the trouble they had removing them. Those of you who know your folklore will know that fairies can be really obsessive about counting things. Telling the story while getting the number of chairs wrong will cause mayhem. There will be extensive fairy arguments about whether this is the right number of chairs. Many of them will have to try and visualise the scene of chaos to try and count the number of chairs they remember being there. Then they will argue about it, and by the time they have agreed that it really was 42 chairs, the festival will be safely over. It works every time.